The development of language abilities goes hand in hand with the development of cognitive abilities. So this semester, as those two topics are covered, you'll see that we typically cover those topics together because, again, they go hand in hand. Advances in cognitive development are a big part of language development. So, again, those things influence one another. When it comes to language development, there are lots of different skills associated with language development, but language development can be broken down into two basic areas: receptive language abilities and expressive language abilities. Of course, receptive language abilities involve the ability to understand language. And then expressive involves being able to actually use language. And the receptive abilities tend to come along a little bit earlier than the expressive abilities. To begin with, babies don't have the knowledge, they don't have the abilities to really produce language, so that expressive part takes a little bit longer. But even from the first days of life, babies are taking in language. So adults and other people in the child's environment play a real important role in this process. When they talk to infants, again, even from birth, it helps with that receptive language development. And it turns out that we almost intuitively, just naturally, use a particular type of speech when we're talking to babies, what we sometimes call infant-directed speech, or sometimes it's called parentese, that kind of thing. But it's a particular way of speaking to babies that seems to hold their attention and help them begin to develop an understanding of sounds and words that they're hearing. Now, when we talk about infant-directed speech, we're not talking about nonsense language or anything like that, but instead, it's more a matter of how we vary our pitch and our tone. We tend to be more exaggerated in the variation of pitch and tone when we're talking to babies, and that seems to hold their attention. The other thing we do is we tend to draw out certain sounds, and that gives them an opportunity to really hear those sounds and begin to identify some of the sounds that are part of their language. And so that's one of the first steps, is identifying those sounds that are part of the language that's spoken in the environment around them. Now, when they actually start to produce language, it's almost like stages that they go through. They go through periods where they do certain things in terms of language. To begin with, at birth, a lot of those noises are just reflexive. So things like the crying and some of those other noises, they're just reflexively making those noises. But when babies get closer to about 2 months of age, they start cooing. And cooing is a more intentional effort with making language, and it's when they draw out those vowel sounds. So the oohs and the ahs and things like that. That's what is involved with cooing. From there, they progress to babbling. And babbling is when they make those sounds that are made up of a consonant sound followed by a vowel sound. So some examples are things like ba, da, ma, pa. And to begin with, they may just make that sound, but then after they've been babbling for a little while, they will repeat those sounds. So ba 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 ba, da 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 da, and so on. And then eventually they get to a point where they add intonation. Intonation is the pattern of rising and falling pitch that's used in a language that helps us fully understand what people mean when they're using language. That's what helps us understand the difference between statements and questions. There's a certain pattern to the rising and falling of pitch that lets us know that someone is making a statement, or maybe they're asking us a question. You can kind of see that change in intonation there. So what happens with babbling babies is after they've been babbling for a while, they also start to add intonation to their babbling. And their patterns of intonation seem to mimic the intonation patterns in the language that's spoken around them. Now, babies' first words typically come sometime around a year, so right around 12 months of age. But even prior to that 12-month mark, we may find that babies are sort of shortening their babbles, and that when they shorten their babbles, they begin to sound like actual words. And so we tend to get excited when those shortened babbles sound like words, and we reinforce. So if a baby who's babbling says da, we may get excited because we think they're saying da, as in daddy. And so we get excited and we reinforce that. We say, yes, Dada, that's Dada, or that's Daddy. And we start to point that person out and do other things like that kind of reinforce the use of that word in that particular way. But it's right around 12 months of age that babies really seem to begin to understand that the words that they're using, those things that they're saying, represent things in their environment. And so that's when we see that one word phase starting. And that one word phase involves the use of what we call hollow phrases. Hollow phrases are single word utterances that include intonation. And based on the intonation that's used with those single word utterances, we know what babies mean with those single words. So baby could say, if they've been babbling da, and then they say da, and everybody gets excited, and they begin to learn that da refers to that particular person, they can say da in one of several ways to mean different things. So they might say Dada, and that means, oh, there's my Dada, or Dada, and that might suggest that they're asking, where is Dada, or something about Dada. So they can communicate a lot in that hollow phrase or in that one word phase using those hollow phrases. And then around 18 months of age, in that period between 18 months of 2 years, they start to string words together. And so they may string 2 or 3 words together, but they leave out certain words. The words that they leave out are the words that are not necessarily that important for the meaning of the utterance. Instead, they're the words that make that utterance grammatical, what we call grammatical morphemes. They leave those out. And so their speech at this stage seems to resemble those old telegraphs or telegrams that people would send before the age of digital media and text messaging and that kind of thing. They would get charged per word, and so they typically only used those words that were most important for communicating meaning. So there were probably a lot of those telegraphs that were sent that simply said send money and didn't include all of the other stuff there. And so we call this type of speech that we see during this period telegraphic speech because it seems to resemble those old telegraphs or telegrams. But then a little bit later, children start to add those grammatical morphemes as they become more competent with their abilities. And that's something that we'll talk about more as we get into development after 2 years of age. Now, we've talked about the fact that speaking to children, talking to children helps them learn a lot about language. And so you can be thinking about what are some things that parents and other caregivers can do to really encourage language development.